About a week after I finished episode 4, I had a very unpleasant experience, and I believe it may turn out to be a life-altering experience. It certainly has had a profound effect on my life since it happened. And what it was I had an attack of vertigo. It wasn't the first time, but it's been several months since I had my first and second attacks, which came pretty close together. The first time I had it, my wife and I were camping up in the Sierras in a camper van. And I woke up in the early morning and turned my head, and the world started spinning. I found that if I kept my head in a particular orientation, the spinning would gradually subside, but that every time I changed the orientation, the spinning began again. And as a result of the spinning, I experienced profound nausea. I didn't actually throw up because I would immediately freeze the position of my head until the vertigo stabilized. It gradually diminished during the day, and I was able to have a fairly normal day. But the next morning I woke up, and it was not quite as bad, but it was still very unsettling, and it still required maintaining position anytime I changed position. Like once I got into a standing orientation and got used to it, I could walk around and function fairly normally. But if I bent over or changed the vertical axis alignment of my head, I went spinning off into the world of nausea. It gradually got better over the next couple of days, but when I got back down to civilization, I went to my general practitioner. First, I did a little research on the web and found out what some of the possibilities were, and the worst case scenario would be that a part of my brain had ceased to function normally. But that seemed unlikely. So I went to my doctor, and he said, well, it's very common in people your age and older. He said, I've had it, my wife's had it, and it goes away. There are a couple of possible causes. One of the most likely, perhaps, is that there are these little hairs in your inner ear, in the semicircular canal, that are immersed in a liquid, and when you move, the liquid moves and the hairs move, and they transmit information to the brain, which then uses that information to orient itself in space. So a couple of things can happen. One of those little hairs can break off and start rattling around in there and sending spurious information to the brain, or particles may coalesce out of the liquid and they'll rattle around and cause the same phenomena. So it's something that's so common the older that you get. Okay, I'm 62, in case you've forgotten. I'm 62, and the older you get, the more common it gets. In fact, they did a test with these people who were in their 80s, and they took them out on a fishing boat, on an expedition on the ocean, and none of them got seasick because their vestibular function had been so altered through cumulative defects of this sort that they no longer got seasick. They didn't have nausea. Well, that would be a positive effect. I wouldn't mind that so badly. The brain finds other ways to orient itself in the absence of the vestibular information. But in the meantime, it's not very pleasant the first time it happens. It's very disorienting and confusing and alarming even, because it's very difficult to function for a while. And myself, there are a lot of symptoms of illness that I tolerate fairly well, but the one I probably tolerate least well is nausea. It's very uncomfortable. And this last episode I had, I woke up in the middle of the night, and I live alone now, so there was no one here but me. I knew immediately what was going on. I did what my doctor had told me to do last time, which had been very effective, and I took anti-nausea medication. It's just Dramamine or Bonine. The 24-hour kind is less troublesome. You just take one pill a day and your nausea pretty much goes away because it anesthetizes the vestibular function. I took a pill about 2:30 in the morning, and I woke up about 7:30, I suppose, and began my daily routine, or tried to begin my daily routine, and found that the nausea had not been relieved. I didn't expect the vertigo to be gone, but I had hoped that the nausea at least would be gone. It wasn't. So I took another pill, dosages 1 to 2. Took another pill and then waited and hoped that it would take effect. And in the meantime, my gut felt so unpleasant that I had the thought that I would rather die than go through this. It wasn't a terribly persistent thought, and I remembered a saying I had heard in Alcoholics Anonymous that suicide is a permanent solution to a temporary problem. I reassured myself that surely this would go away. I would not be nauseous the rest of my life, and there would be good times ahead if I could just hang in. But the rest of that morning, there was an improvement, but I was not only nauseous, but I was very weak, and it could be that I had a mild case of food poisoning. It could be that there was some association with food poisoning and this vertigo that I had. But at any rate, I had difficulty preparing something to eat and then eating it. I felt weak and very debilitated, which was different than the first time that I had had it. So, enough of the nauseating and unpleasant symptoms, at least the physical symptoms, but there were psychological symptoms. That day, I spent most of the day napping in my chair. I tried to stay fairly vertical so that I wouldn't have to adjust so radically when I stood up to go to the bathroom or get something else to eat. So I napped in my chair, and it gradually got better during the day. The next day, it was pretty much gone, largely gone. I still felt not myself. I took another anti-nausea pill, just one, and that got me through the day without feeling like I was going to throw up, but it was not one of my better days. I spent most of the day sitting around reading and napping again. But psychologically, I was depressed. The day after that, I was even more depressed. I felt better physically, but there was the thought, the recurring, the persistent thought that this was going to get worse. I had spent part of the second day online reading accounts of other people's experience with vertigo and with what's called Meniere's syndrome. So some of the accounts were much worse than anything that I had experienced, but at the same time, people had had progressively worse experiences. And the thing was that even if I didn't have progressively worse experiences, the indications were certainly that I would have more experiences at some unpredictable time in the future, that my life stretching ahead of me was going to be marked here and there by episodes of this illness. Considering how unpleasant it was and how depressed I had been, I'm not usually a depressed person. I may have tendencies to be depressed, but I have learned, I have evolved a set of processes that work with small-scale downs that I encounter occasionally. But the techniques that had evolved with me were ineffective in the current situation. And so I felt like if I was going to have more of these, then I had to take some sort of preparatory action. And you might well wonder, as I did at first, what sort of preparatory action one could take. What I came up with was based on my experience with physical limitations I had experienced early in life that I had developed a strategy for dealing with. Back when I was first beginning to smoke pot a lot, I found that what I most liked to do was get stoned, turn on the stereo, sit on the sofa, and stare out the window. We happened to have a house then in Oregon that had a beautiful view out the back window off a deck. It was totally natural, wooded, just like being in the middle of the woods in Oregon in a cabin, except we were, in fact, in the edges of Eugene. So it was a beautiful scene to look out on, and I would spend hours stoned, listening to music, looking out the window, and just drifting. If you do that long enough, what happens is that your muscle tone decreases and your muscles atrophy. And if you did it long enough, you would get to the point that you couldn't get off the sofa or barely get off the sofa, because your body will only maintain the kind of musculature and muscle tone that you require of it. And if it doesn't need it, it's going to dismantle it. I acquired limitations that I only realized when a friend came over and said, "Hey, let's go up to the hot springs, Cougar Reservoir." And it sounded like a fun thing to do. It's a little short hike back into the woods, and it's like hippie fairyland. There's beautiful wooded fern, huge trees, forest. This hot spring just bubbles up out of a crevice in the rock. And people have dammed it up so that as it flows downhill, there's a succession of dammed pools. And they're not very deep, but you can lie in them. And it's nice and hot in Oregon in any time of year. It's rarely too hot to get in the hot spring. Well, in the summertime it could be too hot. But the other benefit of this particular location was a short way down the hill, it encountered a cold stream, a larger cold stream. Shortly uphill from the intersection was a waterfall. And the whole place was just idyllic, beautiful place to go. And now you have to pay to park out on the road and then hike in. But those days, there was just a wide place in the road. You pulled over and you could stay as long as you like. You could spend the night or whatever. So things change. But at any rate, we got up there, and I found that the short hike back to the hot springs was a struggle for me. It took a much more effort than it should have. I mean, I felt much more drained and much less capable. And I thought, well, this lying around looking out the window doesn't prepare one for much activity in the outside world. And I realized that I was either going to have to accept the limitations of my deteriorated condition, or I was going to have to get in better shape to increase my recreational opportunities. And that was the beginning. Actually, in high school, I had been enthusiastic about getting in shape for a while. And then I was in the Air Force, and we had some physical training, but I had drifted out of it. So I got back into it, first in Oregon jogging, and later on getting into going to the gym, until it got to be a thing one did, just like brushing your teeth. It's body maintenance, and if you want to keep your options in the physical world open, then you have to maintain a certain level of physical condition. It's been very rewarding. I can do most anything that occurs to me to do. I can put on a pack and hike out into the woods and carry a heavy tripod and a camera and not be too much the worse for it. It's become a way of life. Thinking of that and how well it has worked out for me over the years, I thought that I probably needed to develop some mental muscle against the future occurrence of these episodes because they were definitely going to recur. But how does one prepare oneself mentally? How does one develop mental muscle or psychological tone, whatever the equivalent term would be? Having had a background or spent some years studying Zen and spent some time in meditation, I was aware that part of the appeal of Zen or meditation of any sort is that one is better prepared to deal with the difficulties of life. There's a whole program that's been developed around stress and pain management, and that has been adopted by some very straightforward and conventional medical institutions. Kaiser, for one, here in California, has a program. The idea is that people can get off medications or decrease the amount of medication that they use. They can feel better with less conventional medical intervention, which, of course, helps Kaiser's bottom line and helps the people as well. So I knew about that. I knew that was a possibility. And I had done some meditation over the years, but never very consistently and never very long term. But I decided, facing the future that was coming to seem very likely, perhaps it was time to get serious. And so I have been. I've been doing fairly conventional meditation practice, sitting and counting my breath, watching my breath, returning to watching my breath whenever my mind wanders, which of course it does. As I say, since I had had some experience with that before, it wasn't a totally strange activity. At the same time, it was a little like drudgery. It wasn't that fun. It wasn't that interesting, exciting, until it occurred to me just yesterday, as a matter of fact. And perhaps I would like to wait longer before I told you about this, because I'm not sure how it's going to play out. But I'm going out of town in about a week, and I'll be gone for a couple of weeks. And I thought, well, I'll go ahead and do this podcast. And it may work better for some of you than it works for me. I don't know in the long run. Hopefully it's going to work for me. To give you that as an option. Because one thing all of us are going to encounter sooner or later is the gradual deterioration of our bodies, no matter what we do. If we're lucky enough to live to say the age of my parents, my dad's 89, my mom's 85, 84, your body deteriorates, and there's certain things you can do, a certain amount of precaution you can take, but inevitably, if you survive, you're going to have problems. In the meantime, there's all sorts of contagious illnesses you can take, and there's accidents you can have. The highways are a death trap and a source of injuries and long-term disabilities that is going to be around. And for anybody that's out there, life is destined to become more difficult. Anyone listening may have occasion at some point in their life to think that some sort of psychological strategy for dealing with stress, pain, emotional discomfort of one kind or another would be a good thing to have. And so here's something that I can't offer myself as an example of how well it works. I'll have to wait until the next time I have an attack of vertigo to tell you whether or not my ability to handle such situations has improved. But in the meantime, I have found a way to make meditation much more interesting. It occurred to me yesterday after dinner. I had a crepe at Kareem's place on Lakeshore. If you're ever in the area, it's a great place. He's French and food's excellent. And afterwards, I took a walk down by the lake, and it was about sunset, and I ended up on the edge of the lake facing downtown. It's actually one of my favorite spots because the sun sets behind downtown. So there are the shadows of the buildings on the water, and between the buildings, there are these patches of reflected sunset, and the waves make these wonderful patterns of reflected shadow and sunset as the angle of the wave changes. Very fascinating, and something that I have learned to do looking at that sort of natural phenomena. One of my favorite things to do, really dating back to pot and acid days, is when I'm looking at something like that, if I turn off the verbal commentary that usually goes on in my head, the visual detail, the visual experience becomes much more interesting. It's a case of trying to do two things at once and doing neither one very well. If you're looking at something and at the same time your brain is running verbal commentary on it, you can't experience the physical sensation, the optical sensation, with the same level of intensity that you can if you marshal more mental resources in its behalf, if you're not distracted by the conversation. This is something that I have gotten to be fairly good at. I can do it for fairly long stretches of time, and it is a form of meditation. But I've never found a way to translate that into more mundane circumstances. On a certain level, I have. But in my meditation, I've never experienced that same sort of rapture and euphoria that I have experienced. And I wondered why. So I came upon a way of thinking about it that I've tried a little bit since, like this morning. And for a good bit of the day today, it's been possible for me to apply this technique that is very exciting and has a lot of potential, I think. Certainly made my meditation this morning more interesting. And that is to regard what's going on in my body and in my brain with the same kind of verbal detachment that I can muster when I'm looking at an interesting visual scene. It brings to mind this phrase that you hear in Buddhism and Zen, in which they talk about seeing a thing as it is. Of course, the reality is that we can't see anything as it is. In fact, there have been some Zen guys who knew that, and they were considered very cool, because one of them, I think his name was Bai Zhang, but I'd have to look it up, said when you realize that your senses are not connected to reality, you are practically there. That's something we can certainly understand from a scientific point of view, because visually, our perceptual system only responds to limited wavelengths. If we were able to respond to other wavelengths with the same sensitivity that we can respond to what we call visible light, what a surprise, the wavelengths that we can see are called visible light, and things we can't see are, of course, invisible. So we can't see infrared or ultraviolet. And if we could, we would see an aspect of the world that is now invisible to us. We would come closer to seeing things as they are if we got more information in terms of electromagnetic wavelengths, and say, for example, we had some sort of way of responding to the gravitational effects of something as small as a wave or a ripple. It's a little difficult to imagine what sort of sensation that would be, but it is possible, I think, for me anyway, to think that, well, imagine if I could respond to the gravitational effect in the same way that I respond to the way an object reflects light, then I would certainly have a different perception of that object, and I would have more information about it, I would come closer to seeing the thing as it is. But of course, even then, we have learned, of course, with instruments and so forth, that something as simple as water has a whole chemistry that we can't monitor at a distance. And we can see the visual effects of surface tension, but we can't experience that except by touch. And of course, we can't experience that at a distance. So at any rate, no matter how sensitive we might become to the physical aspects of an object, there would always be many senses in which we would not be perceiving the object in its full range of natural characteristics. And so, to say that we see a thing as it is always going to be a kind of shorthand. It's not going to be an accurate representation of what's happening. But what I think is an accurate representation is to say that we would more accurately or more fully perceive those aspects of it that our perceptual system is capable of if our attention were focused more completely on that thing. So I'm going to use that term as a kind of shorthand, if you will keep in mind that I realize that it's not a really accurate term, but I'm going to talk about looking at a thing as it is, really as a shorthand for saying looking at a thing without verbal accompaniment, without the range of verbal associations that we might have. Like for me, typically, if I look at a scene like I was looking at last night, I'll think about the photographic possibilities and the settings I would have to make on my camera and whether or not it would be able to register the full dynamic range. Or you might think of some time in the past when you were in that sort of environment and experience that you had then. Or you might think about some future time that you might be in such an environment and you'd have a friend with you and how you would talk about the situation or the experience you were having. So there's all sorts of verbal ways one can get involved in a scene. But to cut those off and isolate our attention to the physical sensations gives us a larger number of neurons to bring to play in perceiving this situation. How I transferred that understanding of the way I could focus on a visual experience as interesting as the ripples on the water is I realized that I could look at the sensations within my own body with the same kind of verbal detachment. Specifically, rather than feeling like my foot is in a particular position or I'm getting certain sensations in my shoulders or my neck, specifically with the word my attached to all these perceptions. If I remove that possessive and just looked at these sensations as sensations that were being experienced in the same way that I was experiencing the waves on the ocean or the ripples on the lake, then I had a similarly heightened sense of those perceptual experiences than I had if I were thinking about my foot is uncomfortable or my neck is uncomfortable. The next step, which is a bit more difficult, I think, is to look at the things that emerge in our brain with the same kind of detachment as something that is happening in experience, but without the intervention of the self. Because in fact, the things that we experience in conscious awareness are the result of a whole lot of mental processing. They get labeled as being the experience of the self and the function of my brain. And in fact, of course, they are the function of the brain with which myself is associated. But my conscious awareness doesn't have anything to do with choosing what becomes conscious, what I think might happen, what I have read that can happen if one pursues this sort of activity, is that the sense of one's mental activity belonging to the self will decrease. Even just in the short interval that I've been playing with this idea, just today, I found myself walking around my apartment with a new sensitivity, a new point of view toward just my movement through the space and my thoughts as I proceed through the day. Ideally, what will happen is that over time, the illusion of the self that I have talked about in earlier episodes will be eroded, and my experience of life will be more in keeping with the reality that we have learned about in our study of the brain and how it works. As my experience of life becomes more attuned to reality, more in keeping with reality, then as the circumstances of life change, hopefully I would be better able to adapt to those changes, as inevitably changes will come. And to put that in concrete terms, I think my recent depression over the vertigo was the fact that I had an image of myself and an image of what is involved in my having a happy life that was disrupted. I mean, my idea of a happy life is a life without vertigo and without nausea and without food poisoning or any of the other ills or deterioration of any of my functions. That ideally is the kind of life I would like to have, but it's not in the cards. If I can develop a perception of myself and of life that is less dependent on a particular set of circumstances, more flexible, more attuned to the reality of the changes in life that are inevitable, then hopefully the next time one of these unfortunate experiences arises, I will deal with it with much more equanimity. It will be something that's not unexpected or unprepared for. I hope that's the case. I'll certainly let you know if I have any success or further failures in this regard.